hello to the online audience and hello to our in-person audience. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Elise Levine. I'm the executive director of the Capital Campus here, and I'm excited to be joined by Mindy Romero, the director of our Center for Inclusive Democracy, which is part of our Price School of Public Policy. Tonight's event is very important, not just because of the subject matter or the fact that we're joined by this wonderful panel of experts, but also because it's just one example of the incredible breadth and depth that USC brings to DC. So I'll give you a few examples. Just over the last month, we've played host to events across a number of topics. We held our first pep rally here. I don't know if anybody was able to attend, but our Trojan Family reception, which had more than 400 people right here in this room. Our Van Act Digital Assets Initiative, which is part of the Marshall School of Business, held a blockchain privacy summit, also here for about 200 people. Our Schaefer Institute of Public Policy and Government Service, which is just about to open here on the 7th floor, hosted a conference on the future of Medicare. We have an Annenberg Center on Communications, Leadership, and Policy that hosts a monthly Africa series. We've had admissions events, and we've had so much more. So I'm really glad you guys could join us tonight for another one of our wonderful events. Networking, collaborating, and exchanging ideas is why we're here. We're asked all the time, why did USC come to DC? Why did we plant this flag in this wonderful building? Really because there's no substitute for coming together to shed light on the most important issues of our time. In January, we'll be welcoming 30 students from our LA campus who will be living and interning here while taking classes here at the Capital Campus. And we'll have many opportunities for you to meet them and network with them and talk to them, and they're really excited to hear from you. So please stay involved with us. This is my plug for signing up for our monthly newsletter. If you're not on our list, talk to me and we'll get you on the list. You can host events here yourself. Tonight's event is part of a two-part series that the Capital Campus is sponsoring alongside the Center for Inclusive Democracy and the Dornsife Center for the Political Future. Tonight's event is focused on sort of the voting and representation aspect. And then next week on the 19th, we have What Mattered Most, which is sort of what happens now. That's taking place in Los Angeles, but you can also watch it online. We're looking forward to meeting you. We have members of our Capital Campus team here. We've got Matt Hodge sitting right there, who's our Executive Director of Advancement, Sydney Wally, who's our Director of Events, Felicia Pratt sitting in the back of the room, who's our Director of Facilities and Community Outreach. So please come say hi to us. And now I will turn it over to the real experts.
I'm going to start us off. So the election, is it really over? So of course we titled this event, 2 months ago. And at the time, I thought, well, chances are, right, heavily so, that it wouldn't be over, that we would probably, have a delay in counting those ballots and almost certainly to some degree legal challenges around the country. And of course, in the common conversation, discord on the media, maybe a lot of conversations that would essentially amount to doubt about, right, the results, or at least doubt in terms of what the next steps were in our democratic process, right, leading up to Inauguration Day. Instead, we saw a pretty decisive victory, at least all 7 swing states, right, going towards Donald Trump. But I think the question still holds. Is it over, right? Certainly, we want to talk tonight, all of us here, about what happened, who voted, how did our election system hold up? Where were the challenges there? That would inevitably happen no matter what. What do we expect going forward? And what are the challenges ultimately for our democracy that maybe we're not looking at a contested election, obviously, at this point, but we still have challenges ahead. And I think all of you here, if you're here tonight, if you're tuning in with us, are wondering just those questions, right? And depending on your perspective, maybe you feel that the future is dire, and maybe you don't think the future is dire, but there are questions and there are conversations that should be had, right? So thank you all very much. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. You all have their bios online if you, of course, if you registered with us. So just in short, I've next to me here, I've got Thomas Hicks, who's the commissioner at a commissioner at the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission, which is the EAC. Next to Tom, we've got Virginia, Kase Solomon, president and CEO of Common Cause. And then next to Virginia, we've got Baxter. And can you please help me with the pronunciation?
Baxter Oliphant.
It is Oliphant. Okay, thank you. Who is a senior researcher at the Pew Research.
Pew Research.
Thank you. In case you're wondering, he is pinch hitting, sitting in for Jocelyn Kiley, who was scheduled for to be with us tonight, but came down with an illness, and so we thank him very much for jumping in and keeping our conversation full. So,
my pleasure.
Yeah. All right. So starting off. This question is actually for the three of you. I'll start with Tom and go down the line here. Please start off I know, see that you decided to sit next to me. This is what you get for it. Thanks. Okay, start off our conversation by giving us, please, your reactions to the election. You really can go anywhere you want to go with this. I know that might feel a little dangerous. The results, anything in the overall election cycle that you feel is important to highlight. From your perspective.
From my perspective,
yes.
One, I want to thank you for inviting me here today. Two, I want to thank all of the election officials who did their jobs this last year, not last week, this last year. They were under a tremendous amount of pressure to not only perform their jobs well, but to perform their jobs under the threat of lawsuits, to perform their jobs under the threat of violence. Nope, that's fine. I don't need notes. To perform their jobs with the world looking on to us. I speak to a number of folks, and I talk to folks around the world. And what a lot of folks said to me was, when the U.S. coughs, the world gets a cold. And so we have exported this thought of elections not functioning well for the last 4+ years. And that was never the case. The elections functioned well. Joe Biden won in 2020. Donald Trump won in 2024. Both those results resulted from the same election equipment and the same sort of processes. And the fact is that the election officials did their jobs in 2020 and they did their jobs in 2024. And I hope that as we go towards the midterms elections in 2026 and the general elections in 2028, that there is still that thought of ensuring that election officials have the resources that they need to perform their jobs well. Because as we look back on this election, I'm going to guess that a lot of jurisdictions are running in the red because of things that they had to do, of additional security, additional things to prepare for by hiring additional lawyers or whatever to ensure, or additional things to make sure that the ballot boxes or drop boxes were secure or had their cameras done for those things. So as we look towards looking forward with the, I don't want to talk about what the next 4 years are going to look like in terms of the administration, but in terms of election administration, we need to make sure that that's funded well.
Thank you. Virginia.
So I echo everything that my friend said, that the elections did what they were supposed to do. And the number of people who, for lack of a better term, really threw down on this election to make sure that it was safe, to make sure it was secure, to make sure that it was accessible, despite so much of the rhetoric and the assumptions that were already, the mis and disinformation, all of those things that were happening. I think it was probably one of the most well-administered elections that we've seen in my lifetime. I can say that much. The amount of work that was done to prepare. Now, that being said, I will talk about some other things. My organization runs something called the Election Protection Coalition. We co-convene with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the NAACP, the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, so many other organizations. There are actually more than 200 organizations that we work to protect our elections in the field. And we work this through a civil rights lens and making sure that we're able to protect voters. And this was by far one of the hardest elections that we've ever had to work. This was my 9th election cycle that I've ever worked as like an adult. And this was next to COVID, and it was hard for different reasons. During COVID, obviously, we had health concerns. There were all kinds of issues about people being able to vote. During 2020, one of the great things that we were able to do was expand access to the ballot. We were able to make sure that more people could access vote by mail and using drop boxes and getting rid of some of the excuses and things like that would be needed. This time, because of the election deniers, because of the big lie, what we found was that there was an issue from the beginning where people were saying the elections are not safe, they're not secure. We saw things like the attack on one of the drop boxes where it was set on fire. While that was only an isolated incident, that is an incident that we saw where there were numerous ballots that were burned, and then being able to have to go back and track those individuals. From a voter suppression standpoint, having to work with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice to make sure that we were filing cases, or they were filing cases against jurisdictions who were not acting in good faith after the Voting Rights Act was gutted. Obviously, this has continued to be a problem with these types of violations because pre-clearance is no longer in existence. And so we saw purges like the one that happened in Virginia, 1,600 voters who were purged from the list. A few days before, we saw in Georgia where people who have requested mail-in ballots who did not receive them, who were far away, and told you had to go and vote in person. Well, if you didn't have the ability to vote in person, you just lost your opportunity to have your voice heard. And so there were numerous incidents like that. We had over 65,000 calls from the time we opened the hotline on July 1st until Election Day. And I haven't even checked to see how many yet have called since to be able to cure their ballot, because there were a numerous amount of rejections. And then combat that with, again, the mis and disinformation and people who were not getting accurate information, people who did not know that you could cure your ballot, people who did not know that same-day voter registration was available to them, people who had their rights restored. There were 18 million people in this country who did not vote because they did not think they could because they were formerly incarcerated individuals. So when we look from that perspective, voter suppression is still, by and large, it is still very much targeted against the Black and Brown communities. And the element of racism that still exists, and the new, what we call, instead of Jim Crow, John Crow ESQ type laws that have come up, or Juan Crow, if you're somebody who has come from the Latino descent like myself, that we know that there are still many, many challenges. The myth of immigrant voting or non-citizen voting, not immigrant voting, but non-citizen voting, was very, very real. And that had very much to do with some of the targeted purges like the one in Virginia. So my reaction to this is, like, from an administration standpoint, it could not have been a better administrated election. From a voter suppression standpoint, we are still struggling. And keep in mind that as a democracy, if you look at most scholars will say, and many of you in this room, we know the voting rights, we were not a full democracy until the Voting Rights Act was passed. So it has been only 60 years. I mean, think about that people have actually been able to vote in this country legally, right? Because of Jim Crow laws, because of everything else. So while I am proud of the work that we've done, I think that there is a lot more work that we need to do. And there are some big questions that we have to grapple with still as a nation.
Thank you, Baxter.
All right. I'm not going to talk about election administration at all. So thank you for having me. Jocelyn Kiley, my boss, got sick. I'm in her place. I have to apologize. She's a lot smarter than I am. And so I'll do my best. But I'll talk about the data and the polling that, at the Pew Research Center we've done, but also we've been watching what others have been doing. This was a decisive but still very close election. And that's something that people really have to keep an eye out, is that a lot of the challenges we had before the election, we're going to have after the election. Democrats faced a lot of headwinds. So the anti-incumbent narrative, there's a lot to it there. But they also faced real weaknesses in key communities that not that long ago people would have thought were solid Democratic constituencies. Real weaknesses. And so returning to the theme of this panel, is the election over? From the data and narrative and what just happened perspective, no, it's not. Because there's still data that'll be coming in. There's still analysis that needs to be done. So I hope you all to stay tuned, because there's going to be a real debate over, some people are, was this a turnout election? Was it just differential turnout, the fancy word that Trump voters showed up and cast their ballots, and the Harris vote Biden coalition stayed home? That's definitely going to be part of it. How much remains to be seen. But there was also clear evidence that there were people switching their votes. Why they did that is also but it's clear people really cared a lot about the economy, particularly inflation. People also cared a lot about immigration. And abortion played a role. Maybe not the role that Democrats were hoping for, but it still played a role. And it's still going to play a role, and we're going to keep an eye on that. Way how exactly that shapes up any of those issues is to be determined, but the Pew Research Center, we're going to be paying attention to that. But there's also just a lot of data that's still going to be coming in that we'll be looking at to really look at what happened. But I would say the turnout story is going to be a huge part of this, but also there is the potential that the coalitions are changing. In Pew Research Center data, we track party identification. We've been doing it for a long, long time. We put out a report almost a year ago, kind of early this year. And Donald Trump didn't start a lot of the trends that we're seeing in party identification. There's been a lot of the rural voters were moving in that direction. White voters were towards the Republican Party, but he seems to have accelerated things. And the results of this election show that he might be expanding that acceleration. There's been a shift. How much that continues, we don't know, but we're going to be keeping an eye on it. And so I think, is the election over? No, it's not, because the data story is still to be told, and we're going to see what consequences what we all just observed are going to have down the road, and how American citizens react to what their government's doing, who they support, who they see is on their side is going to continue to evolve.
Thank you. And I should note, in USC's home state of California, there's still about 2 million ballots, according to the Secretary of State's office, yet to be counted. So, and the battle for control of Congress goes right through California, although we are starting to get a good sense of what those races, those competitive races are shaping up to be. But speaking of data, still being counted, numbers, votes literally being counted in our state. I'm going to stick with you for just a moment longer, if I may, Baxter. So you anticipated my next question, which is great. I was going to ask you about what, in terms of the polling that Pew has done and others, the things that drove this election. Let me just ask you a little bit more than anything else you want to elaborate certainly on, but let me ask you about the accuracy of the polling. I know a dangerous question here, post-election. Your thoughts on kind of how polling and in the quote unquote accuracy of it has evolved since 2016, for instance, when we really saw a lot of this come into the public conversation. And now in 2024, how do you kind of shape up the pre-election polls and what the exit polls are telling us, for instance?
Yeah, I'll separate them out. Well, I'll talk about the polling first, because we finished, and then I'll talk about kind of the issues that we saw in the polling leading up to the election.
Right, thank you.
The polls did pretty well, all in all. I can nerd out and use big terms like margin of error. I think this educated audience will know what that means. And so most of the polls in most of the states were within the margin of error. The polls were saying it was going to be close, and it turned out to be close. The Electoral College is not close. So it's kind of the popular vote is narrowing. Again, California still counting votes. It's going to be closer in the popular vote than it looked like a week ago. And the polls were showing it very, very close. But it's a real challenge in polling to both contact who you think you should be contacting and then predict who's going to turn out to vote. It seemed to do okay. But there are some concerns that the misses were all in one direction again. They tended, not every race, but at the presidential level, it was Trump overperformed where the polls saw, which happened in 2020, which happened in 2016. Not as bad in this election cycle as those previous two, but within the ballpark. That drives people nuts. That's the pollster answer, is that polls are not as precise as people want them to be sometimes. They're just, I can talk about that ad nauseam, lots of issues there. It's just very difficult, as I mentioned, predicting who's going to turn out, predicting the right composition of the electorate, getting everybody who's representative to talk to you. People talk about shy Trump voters. They just didn't want to tell people that they supported Trump. That still seems to be a slight issue. It's not what it used to be. People have made changes. And I like to make a joke. Every election is a polling in crisis election. Every single election, no matter how good the numbers are, because people are changing. We have to always be on our toes to be evolving our methods, staying on top of things. And I think the polling industry is not perfect. It can't do what people want. They want certainty. And we live in a country where most elections have been and they will continue to be very, very close. We're not having the big blowouts we saw in the 20th century. The big popular vote wins just aren't happening for lots of different reasons. And so polling, it's doing well. It did well, but you always have to keep in mind it's not as precise as election counts. You actually have to run the election to know who's going to run the election. But polling to predict the election, maybe not as precise as we all wish it were, but in identifying the issues that the public cared about, I think it did an excellent job. It really did an excellent job in identifying election was about the economy for a lot of people. And good economic news was not breaking through. At the Pew Research Center, we've been asking people how concerned they are about different economic problems. One of them was the high prices for groceries, the cost of living. And we saw no slippage on that. We weren't tracking it month to month like some of the economic measures out there, but the concerns weren't falling. And concerns about affordability of housing since about 2020 had gone up. They were going up leading into the election. So there was a lot pointing to people were very concerned about the cost of living. They were very concerned. And we even saw, despite very good job numbers coming out, increasing concern about people who wanted to find a job being able to find a job. And similarly, we saw that people were still concerned, voters were still concerned about abortion, but it wasn't top of their concerns. It wasn't getting the top. It was there, but maybe not where it needed to be. And so it was foreshadowing some of the results we saw on Election Day. And similarly with immigration, like a lot of people, it was a top issue, but it didn't seem to be breaking as much as people might have expected, especially given voting patterns a decade ago. The Trump campaign seems to, and not just the Trump campaign, just the Republican Party, the conservative movement, drawn a line between migrants and Latinos, and polls were starting to pick that up. We have seen Latino voters increasingly identifying with the Republican Party. We saw a bump in the share saying they were going to vote for Trump. So there were signs there that did show the kind of election we were going to have. And so just to summarize, I think polling did really, really well on just giving a sense of what was coming, what was important to voters, what they wanted to hear the campaigns talk about. But there's always room for improvement, and we'll keep working on that. Speaking for the industry, if I have that power, there's always refinements that we'll learn from this election and move forward.
Thank you, Virginia. So walk us through the remaining steps in this election process, right, in the United States. So the efforts to finalize the election all the way through Inauguration Day. And what are some of the legal challenges we know that there were lawsuits filed pre-election. What are some of the remaining legal challenges that you see that could interfere with that process through January 20th? Or maybe might not interfere with it, but still maybe could be even flying under the radar, but that we should know about?
Well, the election is not over yet. That's what I think I want to name. Like you alluded to that earlier. There are still 9 races. So the control of the House, for example, although we have an idea of where it's going, there are, I think 8 races just in California alone that have yet to be decided. And there are recounts and audits and all of that stuff that are going to be happening. And so by December 11th, they will be focusing on states have to certify the election. And so that certification will then be sent to the National Archivist. December 17th is when the Electoral College vote will happen. And then the next phase beyond that is obviously the votes will then go to Congress on January 6th, and the election will be certified. I do not expect any resistance from Congress in certifying the election unless there is some huge anomaly that we don't know about currently, which, Tom, unless you know something, I don't know. I don't think it's happening. And then obviously we move into inauguration and beyond. Throughout this process, though, I think we'll continue to monitor those people who are advocates who work in this space. Will continue to monitor to make sure everything is going smoothly. And I just want to name the mis and disinformation. Like there is the rumors that are online right now, which are very concerning, and big tech has a big responsibility here. I don't know if anybody here, raise your hand if you have a TikTok account. This is not 1, 2, 3 people. You can admit it here. Okay, 4 people. I don't know about anybody online who will see this later. Don't worry. I have a TikTok account. I will admit it. But I actually follow on TikTok politics because it gives me a sense of what people are feeling, because the polling and the data is just one indication of how people are feeling. And I started following about a year ago, well, not a little more than a year ago, after the big lie, because I wanted to understand how people get caught in this rabbit hole. Right now, the new big lie is that Elon Musk used Starlink to tap into tabulation machines to change the vote. That is on the left. That is not far right. So I just want to name that this election denialism is not something that is only one group of folks are subject to or prone to believe. And so I share that because it is a concern for me on people's willingness to actually accept the results of the election. And so we have to monitor to make sure, while I would like to believe in the better angels that people have in this country, there is a real visceral feeling in response to this election that some are having. And I'm not saying that people would be violent, but the idea that the mistrust in this election is still in any election, especially a major presidential election, is that real. It is concerning. And so making sure that we are combating that mis and disinformation is critical and important to us.
I don't know whether I have a TikTok account or not, but my grandkids send me stuff all the time. And I know what you're talking about, but the explanation given that I buy was what was said before the election, that you were going to see people split their votes. You were going to see people vote just for the president and nobody else. And that's exactly what TikTok is now complaining about. I think, is that correct?
Well, there is a major myth that we've been tracking. So we run a mis and disinformation program in my organization as well, combating mis and disinformation. It's called our Media Democracy Program. And there's actually an institute in California called CITED, the California Institute for Technology and Democracy. Yes. Sorry, Mindy knows better than I do. She sits on the board in California. So full disclosure, different hats. So I think the concern is that people actually think that people tapped in, that Elon Musk rigged it for Donald Trump. Now, the truth is exactly what you said. People split their tickets. They voted one way or the other. That's a rational and reasonable explanation for what happened. People aren't buying it. I'm not saying the entire United States. I'm saying there's a whole cohort of individuals in this country And when you have, I think it was Pew Research, what is it, like a third of young people between the ages of 18 and 35 who get their news from TikTok, that's terrifying. Because we see this move away from media, verifiable media and data for conspiracy theories and narratives. So I wanted to name that because it's not just a singular issue that was coming from one side of the aisle, that this is something that is more pervasive in our society, which requires us to answer a lot of questions around people's beliefs and also understanding of government and civics and how election administration works. And there is work that needs to be done between now and the next election, not to say that it hasn't been done until now. I will say, as far as litigation, well, there was a lot of that, Mindy. So as we know, a New York jury convicted Donald Trump on 34 counts due to a Federal Election Commission complaint around campaign violations and how resources were used. Those convictions had the potential of having jail time associated with them. Well, the likelihood of that happening is not happening. It will likely resolve itself. The prosecution that the Department of Justice around January 6th will likely go away. So those are, I think, some things that, and with presidential immunity being in place, he has the ability to, do things that we don't know yet what he will be doing, but there will be a lack of accountability for many of the things that the incoming or president-elect will do. But aside from that, there were many challenges, court challenges that were filed around the country, specifically to either expand voter access or in many cases to take away access to the ballot. And so all of these things, I think, are just indicative. Many of these lawsuits are just a symbol of the polarization that already exists in this country and this very tribal mentality of my side has to win by any means necessary. And so for me, as we're looking at this and how do we move forward, an organization like mine who has leaned heavily on litigation as a means to be able to create and access and also hold people accountable, given the makeup of the Supreme Court, given the way that things have gone, and include up to and including presidential immunity, we're looking at what are other ways that we can hold people accountable. The Department of Justice will not be a route for us. We know that they're looking to gut the civil rights divisions in many institutions within federal agencies. And so while litigation did play a big role, I don't know that it had a big impact when it came to how voters decided. It did, again, either contract access or take away access and expand access in other places. But I think it's TBD what that's going to mean for moving forward in this country and how do we remedy the issues that we may be facing in the coming years.
Thank you. Okay, Tom. What are some of the main elements of how elections were run by jurisdictions in this election season that have been publicly contentious, regardless of the outcomes that we've seen, just publicly contentious? And I'm talking really not necessarily legal challenges, just from the elements that people have debated, discussed, trust or mistrust involved.
Well, two things that I want to go towards. The gentleman's question on TikTok. In 2007, I worked for the Committee on House Administration, which wrote a report on the Florida 13 race, which showed an undercount of, it wasn't a presidential, it was Congress, dog catcher, supervisor sort of thing. And as you went down the line, it usually, you get less votes. So people will vote for Congress, but not dog catcher. In this race, a lot more folks voted for dog catcher than Congress. And so the question was, where did those 18,000 votes go towards? Was it a flaw in the machines? Was it a number of different issues? We weren't able to basically figure that out. And it was against Vern Buchanan, who I believe is still in Congress, and Christine Jennings. We conducted that investigation for over a year. And what came about from that was basically an end to paperless voting equipment. So now we have machines that have a paper trail. We still need to work on making sure that the folks who have disabilities can use those independently and privately and be able to verify their votes. But a lot of those issues were not solved, but still were being investigated more than almost 20 years ago. So it's not fairly new. In terms of what folks are in contentious thoughts of around this country, this year, I went to 30 states. Every other week, basically, and sometimes twice a week, going to different states to talk to election officials about the role of the EAC in helping them to administer their elections, or talking at conferences or so forth. But 30 different states, sometimes multiple times. I went to Michigan 5 times. It wasn't running for president, but I went there 5 times. And more so than not, when I would go out to have dinner or just go to a museum or go to local, fair or whatever was going on, and talk to everyday Americans about, so what do you do? And, I'm not going to be shy and, I work in elections. Well, I'm tired of immigrants coming here and stealing our elections. Well, that's not actually happening. And so it was, what is the news that they're getting? So I blame a portion of this on the media for, they would come out and say, well, a candidate said A, B, and C happened, but that's not true. Don't even give that candidate that platform to put that lie out there. And so if you say a lie enough, it becomes the truth. And so I think that a lot of that is, I don't want to say history in terms of, if I listen to someone say something on TV or if I read it in the paper, I'm going to believe that that is true because they have those things of a duty to basically tell the truth. The Supreme Court ruled in Times v. Sullivan that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And so I think that sort of basis went away for a lot of this, where people were yelling fire in a crowded theater and not being held accountable. There was a news organization that was held accountable for $750 million, but that's still not really played up enough that, hey, you yell fire in a crowded theater and you will have to pay the consequences for that. And so I think that over the last, I said this in 2020, the number one story in 2020 was COVID, no doubt. The number 2 story was the election. After every COVID story, there was a story about the election. In 2024, every single day, there was a story about the election. And I think that has occurred from 2020 on. We have heard nothing about anything else but the election moving forward. And so what sort of things are going to be said about that? So if you have someone on TV every single day saying the same lie over and over again, you're going to start to believe that, because you're going to say, why are they putting this person on TV if that's not the truth? And so everyday Americans are seeing that. And so they're feeling that, oh, we do have an issue with the economy. We do have an issue with immigration. They're not seeing the other aspects of it because the other aspects are not getting that equal time to say, these are some of the things that we have done to alleviate those pains that you're feeling or that you perceive that are going on. And so I think that going to those 30 states and hearing from, and it's not just red states, it's not purple states, it's not blue states, it's all states of people who have heard these sorts of things and just repeated them over and over again. If I come out and they say that, the sky is purple, the sky is purple, the sky is purple, you're going to look up at the sky and be like, well, it's kind of a tealish sort of thing if you start hearing that over and over again. And so what can we do moving forward to ensure that lies don't continue? And I think that started with oh, well, you know what? I did win the election. It's the same machines. It's the same voting equipment. It's the same people administrating it and same process, but I won this time. Well, you won, you lost last time. And for folks not to hold people accountable to say, I lost, I'm moving on. I'm going to come back in 4 years. It's like, no, I didn't lose and I'm going to stay here. And so we need to hold people accountable when they lose, just like we're going to hold them up when they win. And it's a lesson that people teach their children. And so we need to teach our politicians the same sort of lesson and not let them get away with it. So I'm probably going to get canceled now, but anyway.
Thank you. I'm sure we're going to get back to all of these topics in the Q&A. So Virginia, I need to ask you now about voters. So from your perspective, please talk about the impact of this election cycle on voters, in particular voters from historically underrepresented groups. That could be by color, by age, disability status. How does trust and legitimacy impact voters' ability and willingness to engage in our electoral system?
That is a complex question. And I don't think that we have enough time. And I think if you ask me, you can ask other people in this room who will also have a different perspective. What I can say is that what I hear, and I too have spent, as an organization that has chapters in 30 states and is traveling around the country and meeting with people all the time. And the other thing is I have a family who does not live in this area. I am not from the Washington bubble, and I didn't come from, the ranks of whatever people call the DC elite. I grew up in public housing. I grew up in a city where there was a 56% graduation rate, and public housing was where my family lived, and I grew up in poverty. And much of the people that I grew up with are still living in that same city, and they're still people I love. And so I hear from them, and they keep me grounded in what life is like outside of DC. And I think people felt and are and have felt for a long time left behind and taken for granted. Marginalized folks feel left behind. I work really closely with Bishop William Barber, who runs the Poor People's Campaign. He's a dear friend of mine, and we worked on a campaign to put out, to get poor and low wage wealth individuals to the polls, regardless of race. And having conversations with folks, I'm talking about in rural Appalachia, in the inner cities, and everywhere else in between. The one thing we heard was, nobody's asked for my vote. People are completely disaffected by politics and politicians in impacted communities because guess what? Their lives aren't changing. We talk about a great economy, and yeah, the stock market may be kicking ass right now, but guess what? People are still struggling to buy food. And people are saying, what politician is helping me? When people can't afford to live, when housing is so ridiculously high that people have to get a studio apartment as opposed to a 2-bedroom when you have 3 children because that is the only option available for you. When the dream of a home seems like an impossibility. And then there's also the fact that people don't feel seen or heard in this country, where women, and everybody thought abortion was going to be the issue. But when you see women, young women who have been victims of incest, who have not been able to access an abortion. When you see women who had miscarriages, who died because they could not get adequate health care. When you see people talking about immigrants stealing a Black job, can somebody still explain to me what a Black job is? Because I haven't learned what that is yet. That somehow there is an assumption that every immigrant is a farm worker and have stolen Black jobs. And so what I'm hearing from folks is that by both political parties, they often feel overlooked and not seen. And a lot of people, especially Black women, still showed up and have continued to be the moral compass in this country for so many of us about what's right from a moral standpoint. And so when I hear what it is, it's complex. It's complex. And there is a feeling among many marginalized folks that white supremacy continues to reign in this country because the systems were set up for certain people and not for others. And so if you ask folks right now if they feel like this government that we have, this country that we have, represents them. The weirdest thing about it is I haven't heard one person say, I don't love my country. Every person loves this country, but doesn't feel like it loves them back the same way. And I think a lot of people this election just said, I'm tired. And it has nothing to do with the campaign that Kamala Harris run. Look, I will tell you, it's probably one of the best campaigns I've ever seen. I think it should be studied because in just a matter of a few months, what she was able to do is like incredible. Donald Trump also ran a very strategic campaign because there is no way in hell that I could imagine that somebody could win with as many mistakes as they made. I'm serious. He did something right because his campaign made a lot of mistakes. And still, they were successful. So when we talk about marginalized folks, I am not the representation of every marginalized community. I can only report back the things that I hear, but I think that this is something that requires a different approach moving forward, not only from the political parties, but from organizations who work in communities. And that is being able to have those kitchen table conversations, listening to what people care about, what is impacting their lives. Stop telling people what they need and hearing from people. Because I heard that people said, yeah, it's great that insulin costs are lower, but it doesn't change the fact that I have a $5,000 deductible that I have to hit for my insurance. And my insulin costs $700 a month until I hit that $5,000 and I don't have it. Well, there's a problem with big pharma. And so we have to be able to explain to people how to engage. We have to be able to do certain things that I think and have different conversations and listen to what people are really saying and tailor the solutions that we are creating as policymakers and people who have access to power through legislation by hearing what they say and lifting up their voices and being their representation in those halls of power.
Thank you. And thank you for taking on what is a complicated question, obviously. Yeah. Okay, this question is for all three of you. Whoever wants to jump in first. As you see them, as you see them, what are the short and long-term challenges? This is another big question. From your perspective, so I don't expect you to focus on everything, obviously. But what are the short and long-term challenges ahead for our democratic institutions in the U.S.? What needs to be done to strengthen our democracy? What's on your mind tonight?
I'll jump in first. And at the Pew Research Center, we don't do policy prescriptions, but I'll tell you the questions we're going to be looking at. in our surveys, what we're going to focus on. One of the big things, we've studied polarization a lot. That is still a huge question because the election results are so close. We're still a polarized country. This isn't some, oh, look, we all agree now. There's still going to be polarization, and how that impacts how people react to what the Trump administration is going to be doing, how people react to each other and treat each other. We're going to be paying close attention to that. There's also, as Virginia just pointed out, there is a representation crisis. The survey data finds this, just like what she's hearing from folks. We see that on our surveys. People don't feel represented. They don't feel that either party is really a home for them, and it's more like they know the other party is not the home for them. So they'll vote. They know who they're going to vote against. And that is part of the reason we get these whiplashy elections. We had 2016. Oh, we're going Trump. 2020, Trump's out. Now Trump, it's very whiplashy. And a lot of it is people just, they know they don't like what's going on. And so they vote against it and they'll switch. And it's potential that just happens again. In 4 years, we have Democrats come in with unified government. It's possible. Haven't looked at the map yet, but we just it's one of those things. People just feel unheard and unconnected with institutions and unconnected to their representatives. And we have been tracking at the Pew Research Center their confidence in election systems. In just, are you confident your vote was counted? Are you confident other people's votes were counted? How well were elections run in your community? How well were they run around the United States? And one of the really interesting findings we have had is people trust and continued to trust their local elections, their own states, but it was all out there. And we're going to be seeing if that changes. Does that change as people, but also prior to 2020, we did not have a partisan gap in the share of Americans that were confident in our elections being well run at the national level between Republicans and Democrats. And that's including independent leaners. Then in 2020, a big gap opened up from the news media, but also Republicans were getting very consistent messaging from the elite leadership of their party, and they lost confidence in elections. We have a survey in the field right now to see if that has changed. It didn't change after 2020. 2022, big gap remained. It opened, it stayed open. But it is concerning on a normative level. Sorry, I have a PhD in political science. That's way too big of a word. But just if you only are trusting elections when your side wins, that has big questions, and we are going to be paying attention to that to see, do Democrats now move in the opposite direction? And while the Harris campaign hasn't been doing this in the same level as 2020, there are messages out there of people who are like, you should be suspicious of these. Does it lower trust for both parties? We're going to be paying attention to that. So those are the questions we're going to be paying, but also we're going to be doing surveys, as we always do. Is Trump is a very different political leader. He is very different than previous presidents in his habits, his behaviors, the people. He's taking a very different approach to staffing his administration, we're seeing. And some people are going to love that. Some people are going to hate that. And what the share of the public take those different approaches is going to have massive implications and massive impacts on future elections. Only 2 years until we've got the midterms. It's not that far away. And we're going to be paying really close attention to just see how people react to these things. And so it's an open question, though, from the public opinion sphere of how they're going to react. Some people are really going to feel finally heard. Other people are going to feel the exact opposite. And who that is, how that breaks down by demographic lines, we can make predictions, but until it happens, we don't know. And so that's the big question of how the public perceives what seems to be shaping up as wanting to be a very conservative, populist administration. It's a very big question of how people are going to react to that and how they perceive whose interests are being served by what changes.
Thank you. So you've got your work cut out for you in the public opinion world. Yes.
I think that as we move forward, one of the things that I would like to see is that confidence is restored in terms of voting equipment. Our agency came together and voted for the voluntary voting system guidelines 2.0, which will allow for the purchase of new voting equipment, which will be more secure, more accurate, and more accessible for folks. That is going to need money that's going to be needed to pay for those new machines. I view that as if you don't have confidence in the machines, like folks were saying that they didn't, well, we're looking to get new voting equipment and having that voting equipment tested and more secure. It's not. I always equate it to basically the iPhone 1. You can still use an iPhone 1, but if I did, then people are like, hey, you need a new one. But if I have an iPhone 20, whatever is out now, people are say, hey, that's a new one. That's going to function much better. And so we're looking to make sure that as we go to 26 and 28, that voting system manufacturers are building towards the 2.0 standards. And we hope that the federal government pays into the purchase of these new equipment, but also that states have skin in the game and also have some sort of sway into that. Going toward, and it's just going to sound ridiculous, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think that a lot of the political division that we've had over the last 20 plus years is because there's not a common enemy. In 2001, we had 9/11, and I think the country came together for some sort of, united front for a common enemy for folks. And it wasn't looked at as us versus them. And I think that 49% of the country voted for Kamala Harris, 51%, I'm just throwing out numbers, voted for Donald Trump. And it's a us versus them sort of mentality, as opposed to Donald Trump is coming in as president for all of us to be our president. Ronald Reagan said on the United Nations floor, if an alien threat comes from outer space, and yes, he did say this, I've seen the video, it's not AI. If an alien threat shows up tomorrow, how quickly would not the United States, but the world come together against that common threat? And so I'm not saying that we need to go to war or it's some sort of issue like that, but I think there is a common threat that we all are facing now. And that, we saw that in 2020, and that was COVID. But I think that if we look towards how do we make our country better, and I think that there are common threats out there to show that our country can get better and show that we are one nation, that we all are fighting for one thing, but it's the thought that we are still in this camp of us versus them. They are women, we are men, they are Latino, we are Black, we are white. And we need to get out of that sort of mentality to say, hey, we are for Harris, we're for Trump, or whatever. It's more of how do we ensure that our children are going to be around for tomorrow to take care of us? How are we going to ensure that our elderly are here, that we ensure that we take care of them? And so how do we move forward with that? I don't have the answer, but I have the question of how do we move forward?
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, I want to make a joke about aliens, but I won't. Something to do with Will Smith and the Independence Day. Okay, Virginia, did we give you enough time?
Yes, thank you. I think one of the things that I consistently go back to, it's interesting because democracy was 35% of voters said that democracy was one of the key issues that they cared about. I don't know that we define democracy the same way in this country. And I think there is a national conversation that needs to happen about what it means to live in a democracy. And I will say democracy around some folks, and they will remind me that we are a democratic republic, for example. They will correct me. We are not a democracy. We are a republic. And so I have to sometimes sit with that because I sometimes want to be the girl who grew up in the project and say the things that I want to say. But what I will say is that we have to define what it means to live in a democratic country. And while we are not a direct democracy, other than ballot initiatives and some other things, we look for representation, but we are a democracy. And I don't know that it's defined the same way. I don't think we have a shared meaning. I don't think that we have a shared vision, a North Star in this country of what it means. The middle class has changed. There was this moment in time where everybody had this shared aspirations of being in the middle class. We talk about the middle class, but who is even the middle class now? They haven't been able to define it very well. When we talk about what a multicultural or democracy looks like, it then is like, who is the right kind of immigrant? Right? There is so much that we don't have shared definitions for in this country, that I think it creates the ability to say the us, them, because we're not looking for the likeness. I am concerned about people's understanding of how government works and what government's role is. Because when I hear certain things about what the government can and cannot do, especially at the congressional or presidential level, I'm like, that's not what they're supposed to do. Like, your roads aren't being fixed by the president of the United States. You're not, I mean, yes, there's like big infrastructure money that can go into helping to fund those things. But not everybody even understands what the role of the branches of government and the different levels of government, what the role of the municipal government is versus Congress or your state legislature. There are basic civics things in this country. And I'm not saying that people are stupid. I'm saying that we haven't been teaching it. We have not been teaching a lot of things in our country. I mean, damn, my own kid didn't have a signature because apparently they wiped out penmanship. So can you imagine what they're not learning about civics? How many people don't know? I mean, and so my concern is that fundamentally, not everybody we don't have a shared definition for what it means to live in a democracy. There's a lack of understanding by many of what the government's role is and what the different branches of government do. And then again, you know, state, municipal, federal, what their responsibilities are. And so I think there are just some basics that we have to figure out. How do we both define and figure out how to make sure that people understand how things work so that we can start to move this country forward with some semblance of shared understanding. Because again, it is one of the core challenges that we face. The other thing I will say, as far as threats are concerned, for me, one of the biggest threats is the amount of money that is in politics. I think since the Citizens United decision and the egregious amount of money, spent $16 billion on this presidential election, or 15.9 as of the last, it was up just a couple of weeks ago, like 15.9 billion that had been spent. Billion with B. And that's just for the presidential. We're not talking about down ballot races, congressional races, the amount of money that corporates were able to put in, the fact that Elon Musk was able to do a lottery and it was legal. Y'all, it was legal. The amount of David Trone, I live in Maryland, and so David Trone was running for Senate, and the amount, $65 million of his own personal money to run against Angela Alsobrooks. He lost. But that was because she had an amazing organizing ground game. She did not have anywhere near the amount of money. But guess what? That was the rarity. Usually the most money wins. We've been seeing people knocked off. So the amount of influence and control that corporations have and big money has in our political system, I think, is a real concern and something that we have to look at. Because how can you expect politicians to vote for legislation that would control some of this if they themselves need the money and somebody can just put up a lot of money to win to run somebody else against them who will follow through with their wishes and desires? And so those are the big things for me that I'm thinking about.
Thank you. Just imagine all those many billions of dollars if we could have put them towards the policy issues that people actually care about, right? All right. Thank you all very much. We're going to open it up to Q&A. We did start a little later, so we're running a little over. Those of you that are joining us online, obviously you are welcome to continue to stay with us. We're going to keep recording, but we're going to see what how the conversation goes here. I do want to remind folks online that we are taking questions. I'm going to go ahead and take the first question in the room here, and then I'll switch over to see the questions we have virtually.
So there's been a lot of talk, at least in the beginning of your presentation, regarding the amount of data that's out there regarding election security, regarding polling, regarding voter suppression. And it's arguable that these days America is a low information country. It's driven by emotion in terms of that's part of the reason why we see so much money in politics and why money wins. So what steps are being taken to bring the information level up, to utilize the data that we all have access to demonstrate facts and make them able to be interpreted by the masses?
Well, at the end of June, the EAC puts out our biannual report, the election EVES, Election Administrating Voting Survey. So this month, we're in November. So December, January, February, we will be surveying the states to find out. I basically call it the census for elections. We will gather that information and publish it by the end of June. We disseminate that to Congress. It's then available on our website. We have hard copies as well, but we can't force people to take in that data. What will be in it will say what the number of votes were, what machines were used, vote counts, the whole nine. It's basically the census from A to Z on all that information. It's mandated by Congress, so we are trying to get that information out. In terms of the other aspects, I'm going to leave it to my colleagues to answer that part of, since they're basically out and talking to everyday Americans about their voting experiences.
I can go next. I mean, I can tell you what my organization is doing, and I know what in the kind of democracy orgs and civil rights orgs are trying to do. One of the things that we're working on, and my organization, we do put out reports on how to, I look at myself and our work as like a way to talk to regular folks around wonky policy things that most people aren't going to sit and maybe read the full report. So we're like interpreters for that. And so we've been trying to figure out how are we, and have been amplifying information in different ways. And so we're trying to go more where people are at. So we're about to start doing some stuff on Xbox, believe it or not, because it's a huge platform. When you look at Spotify, being able to run ads on Spotify, this was snippets of data, public service announcements, being able to, obviously on the social media realm, being able to get as much in there. We're doing more in podcasts. Traditional media we still go through traditional media, but they're not necessarily news outlets. Not everybody's going to read the New York Times, but a hell of a lot of women read the 19th News, for example. And so trying to figure out where people are that we want to reach, right? We're not trying to reach, no offense, all of you, because you're like really into this. We're trying to reach the people who aren't in ways that are bite-sized and easily digestible, where they can help consume information that is truthful, accurate, and going to help advance, our goals. So yeah.
Yeah. At Pew Research Center, we're not involved in like what should change, but our data is really clearly showing that the information environment is changing, and it's going to be a huge challenge. Virginia mentioned earlier, huge numbers of young people are turning to TikTok for their information, for their news. TV is dead in that age demographic too. Like we just did, some of my colleagues just did a big survey. Nobody 18 to like 30, 35 is watching the TV anymore. So it's going to change. But we also shouldn't be too nostalgic for how it used to be. This has always been a trial. I was recently just reminded, during the O.J. Simpson trial in the 90s, there was a nice natural experiment, as they call it, where I forget which one news network went heavy into the O.J. trial. Another one was like, we're going to stick to hard news a bit more. We'll cover it, but we're going to stick more. The heavy O.J. news kicked their butt. They won. People, they always like the entertainment. And so I do think the challenge where people are going to be is it's always been a challenge to get people to pay attention to things that are complex and heavy. And it's not going to be what we saw in the past. And part of the reason in the past is there were only 3 TV networks and there was nothing else on when you ate dinner. So you were forced to watch the news. And I don't think that's the solution, that we force everybody to watch the news. And the data is very clear, though, that creative thinking is going to have, I don't want to speculate on what that looks like, but generational change is happening in the news environments. People are turning to very different, but it doesn't mean that it's hopeless. It just means it's going to be different. And I think it's exciting, but it's also not my job to solve. So it's easy for me to be excited. But the data is very clear that people are changing their habits and where they go. But some of those habits have been with us for a long time.
Thank you. I'm going to take the next question from somebody online. Any one of you can take this question. So did the war in Gaza impact the presidential election? Thoughts?
Oh, yeah. So it's interesting because there is polling data that shows that a lot of people did not feel comfortable supporting either candidate and either went to and not that Jill Stein and Cornel West, they weren't determinant factors, but there were a lot of, as far as swaying the election one way or the other, but there were actually a lot of people who did vote for either Harris or Trump based on their position on Gaza. So it's really interesting because then when you look at the Jewish vote in particular, Jewish folks actually the second highest demographic in support of Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. So there's a lot of data to cut when it comes to that, but it definitely did play a role.
Thank you.
A lot of my fellow useless intellectuals, especially on the right, but a surprisingly large number on the left, have been arguing that this may be the portent of a major class realignment between the Republican and Democratic parties. I'm wondering, number one, what you believe about the idea that the Republicans are now a non-professional working class party and the Democrats are now a largely professional, largely educated party. And number two, if the Democratic Party does decide to actively interpret that and go against that, who might we think of as the Democrats to watch in 2028 to lead the ticket as entrepreneurs about that?
As I mentioned earlier, Pew Research Center, we do a big analysis of party identification. And that is, we just ask people, this isn't if they're registered Republicans or Democrats, you're Republican, Democrat, Independent. If you're an independent, we ask you which way you lean. Experience has shown those leaners really just don't want to tell you they're partisans, but they're partisans. And we have been seeing this shift. Especially among white voters, the college degree holders versus the non-college degree holders has been growing. It predates Trump. It really seems to be much more of an Obama era holdover. It was really the 2008 to 2010, we really started seeing that accelerating. And it has been going, but I do not want to ever say what we've been seeing in the past is going to continue forward. We don't know. But in our data, it has been a big shift. But there are still a lot of people that fit the older definition of the two parties within both parties. So I don't see evidence yet personally for a whole-on realignment that it has happened. I do think there is evidence that it could be underway. I don't want to speculate whether it's going to continue or not. This election seemed to continue it, but there's no idea to know if people who just voted for Donald Trump are now going to start calling themselves Republicans or Republican leaners. They may continue to call themselves, because vote choice and party identification are very different things. So it depends on what you're talking about. I do think there is competition for votes that both parties would have written off 5-10 years ago. That there are people who are willing to switch their votes or whatever it might be. That's there. Again, as I mentioned at the top, there's real weakness in the numbers for the Democrats. Was that just a worldwide anti-incumbent echo from the COVID? Maybe. Was it a realignment? Maybe. We're going to be tracking it. We will update, probably not this year, wait a year or so, update our numbers. Gallup is doing it too. There's lots of people out there, and it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Definitely. Things have changed. Things may continue to change, and there are lots of complexities. As I mentioned, you can vote for one party but identify with the other, and I'll leave it to others to debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But it's very interesting. Trump won every single battleground state, and then the Democrat Senate candidates held on to a lot of those. Some of that was people dropping off, not voting, but some of that was people voting for one party and the other. And as more data comes in, as we start being able to link our surveys with voting records, we'll really get a better picture of exactly what's going on.
Thank you. And party registration also, right? Tracking, does that actually change where it's available? Do you want to jump in?
I was going to say that I'm not really qualified to answer that, but I would want to see, I am really interested to find out how people will vote in 26 and 28 who were union members when Tesla has been so anti-union. In other aspects, or some of the hotels that Mr. Trump has owned have been anti-union. So it's going to be interesting to me to see how this plays out down the road. But I wonder that if folks voted more with their pocketbooks. So my colleague has said, I don't know if people are going to vote one way because they did it this time, or how will things be in 2 years and 4 years from down the road. So I am really interested to see how that plays out.
The Democrats got slaughtered in 2004, and the same narrative was running around because John Kerry was looked at kind of like an elitist, and he wasn't somebody who could, you would want to have a beer with, right? So I think it's going to be interesting, especially because the Republican policies don't necessarily always align with. So there's this be careful what you get for kind of thing, because once you have a trifecta, now you actually have to deliver. You can't blame anybody. So it's going to be interesting. I think as somebody who is, a student of politics and a student of history, it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. I think as far as in the Democratic Party, if you're talking about who could emerge as leadership, one of the things I will say is, and speaking with, and I don't know if you saw this in some of the data or if you even have researched any of this, but a lot of the people in 2020 who supported Bernie Sanders were also people who supported Donald Trump. And two couldn't be more opposite individuals, but also who resonated with voters who were those working class folks. So it'll be interesting to see how somebody like an AOC, who is, for whether you like her or don't, she is a brilliant communicator to everyday folks. She has a way to connect and relate with people. And so many people I've seen have said, I like her because she's real, and I like Donald Trump because he's quote unquote real. So I think it is the Democratic Party and the Republican Party is going to have to do a really good job of keeping it real, right? Talking to everyday folks. And so I think that's TBD, but it will be interesting, especially with this new freshman class that's coming in. And it's a very extreme on the right freshman class, and actually more moderate coming in on the Democratic side, because many people had to move more to the middle on the Democratic side in order to get elected. So it's going to be really, really interesting, I think.
I would say look at
But you did have more to say.
Just one quick thing. I know it was like you just prompted something. If you look at the electoral map in 1984, Ronald Reagan won 49 states. And less than 8 years later, we have Bill Clinton. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and close out our evening. We've got a number of other questions online, but I think we've covered most of them. Thank you all very much. I want to, of course, thank our esteemed panel here. And even though you said you filled in for your boss, you're part of that. We're very fortunate to have all three of you, really top experts in your field, to come here and spend your time tonight, give us your thoughts on a topic that everybody is still thinking about, and at an individual level, I know, trying to see what it means, right? The results of the election, whether you're happy or not happy about them. I think we all can agree that there's change in America, and everyone is trying to figure out exactly what that means for themselves, for their work, for their communities. So hopefully more conversations. There will be many more. And at the Price School, at the Capital Campus, at CID, Center for Inclusive Democracy, we'll continue those conversations. We thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you going forward. Thank you to everybody online. Have a good evening.